Yevamos Daf Kuf Yud Dalet. It takes us to the end of the 14th parak of the Masechta and begins the 15th. The end of the 14th is discussing the sugya of a katan who's doing an avera and whether or not we have to stop him, or we got obligated to or not. The Gemara is going to bring a long list of proofs as to whether or not you have to stop a katan from doing an iser. The last three will go back to our most recent Mishnah. Then we'll start the next parak, which goes back to the topic of aguna. What happens when a man and a woman both travel away to Medina Siyam, and she comes back and says, "My husband is dead. I should be allowed to remarry. Do we trust her or not?" So let's begin. The Gemara is discussing what's the situation when you see a katan doing an iser. So there's three possible reactions. One could be that you could just ignore him. That's the simplest. Another could be that you are actually allowed to encourage him. You can tell him to do the iser. There's no iser on a katan. He's not mechuyev in mitzvahs. Or the most severe would be that you are obligated to stop him. So do you just leave him alone? Can you help him? Do you have to stop him? Now the Gemara assumes that it's understood that you're not allowed to tell him to do the iser or do the iser to him. You're not actually put him in a situation of an iser. The question is, if he's just doing his own thing, do you have to stop him or do you not have to stop him? So the Gemara's first proof is from the case. We have a Mishnah that talks about what happens when a guy or a katan sees a fire burning in a Jewish home and he wants to put it out. So the Mishnah says, if a guy comes to put a fire out for you, you don't have to tell him anything. Don't tell him put it out. Don't tell him don't put it out. You're not obligated in his Shmira Shabbos, and therefore if he wants to put it out, even if he's expecting you to pay him, the implication is you don't have to stop him. If, however, a katan, a child, comes, you have to tell him don't put it out. So you see a clear proof there that you cannot take the middle road and just ignore him. You have to stop him. So the Gemara says, that's of course talking about a fire on Shabbos. So the Gemara says this is not a proof, because here we're talking about where the katan's looking towards you he wants to see what you want. He's watching his father and he's trying to see if his father agrees to what he's doing or not. So if the father doesn't show signs of disapproval, that is an innate approval. There is no middle ground here. You're either approving or disapproving. Therefore, since you're not allowed to approve, you have to disapprove. Now, says the Gemara, hold on a second. If that's true, so then that means that in the case of the guy is the same thing. The guy where we said that you don't have to stop him is also talking about where there is no middle ground. That means by not stopping him, you're approving. So how are you allowed to do that? There's an iser, ma'isa akam. You can't have a guy do a malacha for you on Shabbos. The Gemara says this is something else. The guy is not doing it for you. The guy is doing it for himself. He understands that you're going to pay him, and therefore he's doing it for himself for the money. And this is not an iser of ma'isa Shabbos, even though you're communicating to him by not stopping him that you do want him to do it. All right, now the Gemara goes to its second proof. It says if you have a Talmid Chacham who has a son who goes to his grandfather, that's his mother's father, his grandfather's an Am Haaretz, and he feeds him. So we know that there's a rule you're not allowed to eat fruits from an Am Haaretz because it is considered demai. It's also for you to eat them. You have to assume that they did not have meiser taken from them. This kid is going to his grandfather who's an Am Haaretz. Do you have to stop him? So you're allowed to send him there. You're allowed to allow him to go there. You don't have to stop him from traveling there. If he brings fruits back, you don't have to re-meiser them. You don't have to assume that they're also. You don't have to take them away from him and meiser them. So now this person, this child of yours, is doing an iser demai. So how are you allowed to do that? The fact that it says that you don't have to interfere indicates that you're allowed to leave him. You're allowed to just ignore him. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan again, he rejects this proof, and he says, no, since Demai is only the Rabbanon, that's why they were Mekel. However, if it would be Daraisa, you would have to interfere. So the Gemara says, hold on a second, Rabbi Yochanan is answering both kashas both ways. The first proof was a proof that you have to interfere, that you have to interfere, and here it's a proof that you don't have to interfere. He's pushing away both proofs. Which way does he hold? So the Gemara says Yevamos was mistapik. He didn't know the answer to this question, and therefore he's pushing all the proofs off until he finds something which makes him convinced as to what the correct answer is. Now, I can bring another proof very much in structure of this one. You're telling me that this is only an iser d'Rabbanan because it's demai, but we have a very similar brisa that says that if he is a Kohen and he's going to his grandfather who's a Kohen, you don't have to be afraid that he's going to give him Truma Tameya. You're allowed to let him take the fruits. Now Truma Tameya is an iser deraisa. Don't tell me it's only D'Rabbanan. Truma Tameya is a deraisa. So how are you allowed to allow him to take the Truma Tameya? So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about Truma D'Rabbanan. The Truma we're referring to is Truma D'Rabbanan. Could be the Truma deraisa you would have to take away from him because you do have to interfere. All right, next proof, this is the Gemara's fourth proof, is a brisa that says that a child is allowed to nurse from a oivedes kechavim or from a non-kosher animal, and you don't have to be concerned that it's an isser of a kohen drinking non-kosher milk. Now, it goes further. It says you're not allowed to feed him treif meat, you're not allowed to feed him nevela meat, you're not allowed to feed him shkatzim and ramasim. However, he's allowed to nurse from all of these. Even on Shabbos. Shabbos is an additional isser of mafarik, of taking milk out of the place in which it was created. So why are you allowed to do these things? Now, let's just finish the brisa there. Let's finish the Mishnah there. The Mishnah concludes that Abba Shaul says that the minig is that we allow nursing even from a behemoth tahora on Yontif. That's not referring to a child. Now, so the Gemara's kasha is that we see here that a child is allowed to nurse Isser milk. How are you allowed to do that? Obviously, you don't have to stop him. The Gemara says this is different because it's a sakana. If a child doesn't eat, and then he's going to suffer from malnutrition. The Gemara says if it's a real sakana, then the same is true even for a gadol. Why would we say it's a child? Sakana is a sakana. The Gemara says no. The point here is to tell you that a child is generally considered to be a sakana. If he doesn't get the proper milk and nutrition, that is dangerous to him. An adult, yeah, if you figure out that it's a sakana, then it's the same as a child. But you have to go figure that out. In a child, there's a general assumption. All right, now the Gemara wants to analyze Abba Shaul's position. So the Gemara says, let me understand Abba Shaul here. Abba Shaul said you're allowed to nurse from a meher tahora on Yom Tov. The Gemara says, what are we talking about? If it's a sakana, you should be allowed to do it on Shabbos. If it's not a sakana, why are you allowed to do the Isser Mefarik? So Gemara answers that we're talking about where there's no sakana, but the person is in pain, he is suffering. Mefarik by nursing is a shinoi, it's klachar yad. It's not the correct way of milking an animal is not to nurse from it. The correct way is to squeeze it with the hand. So here it's only the Rabbanan Isser, and they didn't make a gzeira in a case of a Isser on Yom Tov, which is only mefarek, which is a lav. Shabbos, which is a Isser skila, there they did make a gzeira, and they asked for it even klachar yad. Okay, the Gemara now goes to its next proof. And this is in the sugya of Shratzim, where the Torah says not to eat disgusting creatures. It says le'seichlam several times. It's repeated. The Gemara says one of them is to be read as le'sachilim. Don't feed them. You're not allowed to feed this non-kosher meat to children. So we're warning an adult not to feed it to a child. So the simplest trial would be we have to stop the child. It says lahazer gedolim al kanim, to warn the adults about the children. So the pashtus is that to go so far as to say that you're not even allowed to let a child eat them on his own. You have to stop him. Which says no, not necessarily. It could be that you don't have to stop him. All it's saying here is that you're not allowed to actually feed him on your own. Our next proof is very similar, except instead of talking about shratzim, it's talking about blood. There it says kol nefesh mikam le'soichal dam. So kol nefesh mikem lo sochal is to include gidolim on katanim, to warn the adults about the children. So Gemara says again, this is not saying that you have to stop him if he's eating it on his own, and just saying you're not allowed to feed him yourself. And then we have a third proof with the same structure, and that's by kohanim, where you're not allowed to be mitame. It says emor ve'omarta, emor lekanim, so it's emor ve'omarta. That is to teach the adults that they have to be careful about the children. So what exactly is that? So the Gemara first wants to say that you have to stop a Kohen child from being Matami himself. The Gemara says, no, you are not allowed to be Matami him, but you don't have to stop him from being Matami himself. Now the Gemara says, why do I need the same halacha repeated 3 times? Why do I need 3 psukim to tell me that you aren't allowed to be mitame him, you aren't allowed to feed him shratzim, and you're not allowed to feed him blood? Why should I think any of them are different than the others? So the Gemara says there's a reason. If we would only say it by blood is an isakaris, which is very severe, I wouldn't realize that it applies to the others. If we would only say it by sharetz has a severity that it is usher even a very small amount, the size of an adasha, the size of a bean. The blood, though, has a much larger share of a revis. But only say it by those two are more severe, because there, and so it applies to everyone, as opposed to Kohanim, which is limited only to Kohanim, so it's less of a severe Isser. And if we would say it by Kohanim, I wouldn't know by the other two, because Kohanim has a lot, because a Kohen has a lot of mitzvahs, and therefore he has higher standards and restrictions. So therefore, all of these have to be listed. The Gemara now begins a set of 3 proofs from our Mishnah discussing Yibum of a Cheresh or Chereshes. So we have 3 cases. In all 3, you have 2 brothers married to 2 sisters, and there is a Cheresh or 2 in one of the marriages. So you have one of the marriages is a pikach to a pikachas, no problem there. The other marriage, in the first case, the husband is a Cheresh. In the second case, the wife is a Chereshes. And in the third case, they are both a Cheresh and a Chereshes. Now, who dies? So if the husband in the marriage that contains a Cheresh, or the 2 are, if he dies, so then the woman that's falling to Yibum is falling to Yibum to a Pikach married to a Pikachas. So she's an Achos Ishto falling to a normal, healthy, full-fledged Daraisa marriage. Pikach to a Pikachas is a full-fledged marriage. This woman's falling as an Achos Ishto of the wife. So she has no Yibum. She goes free without an issue. If, however, it's the other way around, the Pikach married to Pikachas, the Pikach is the one who died, so then the woman who's falling to Yibum is falling into a Cheresh marriage. The Cheresh marriage is only D'Rabbanan, and therefore the Zika of the Pikachas is falling into that marriage, is a Zika D'Oraisa. It does not get pushed away by the marriage of the Cheresh D'Rabbanan. So the halacha therefore is that you have a problem, because the guy is married to an Achos Zikukaso, and the Yevama is a Achos Ishto. So you gotta send the Yevama away. If it's a Chereshes in the marriage and the man is healthy, he can do Chalitza. Otherwise, if he's a Cheresh, he has to marry her and she's kind of stuck. What does he do with his wife though? So there, he has to give her a get. And you say that the get works because it was an original weak marriage. It was a non-verbal marriage ceremony, so it can be a non-verbal divorce ceremony as well. Now, the question is, in all 3 of these cases, why does he have to give her a get? Why doesn't he just stay married to her? Worst comes to worst, it's an Isser Achos Zikukaso, even if that's a Deraisa, but a Cheresh has the status of a Katan. So the worst is the problem with the first 2, the answer is simple. There is an adult here. There is a pikeach or pikachas involved. So that's the isser. This is on both the man and the woman if they stay married. So even though you're not worried about the cheresh or chareshes doing an isser, you are worried about the other party who has no excuses. The problem is, what happens when it's a cheresh married to a chareshes? There you have both of them are okay. So there, the Gemara answers, it's a gzeira. If you allow them to stay married, people are going to assume that the Zika of the Pikachas who fell into this marriage, into Yibum, that Zika is not anything, it's broken, which is not true, because that Zika is not broken by a Achos Ishto of a Cheresh marriage. And people are going to end up assuming there's no Zika, so they'll allow her to go Yevam L'Shok. In order to prevent that from happening, we had to make the Cheresh and Chereshes break apart. We can't have them stay married. People have to understand that there is a Zika here, and she's an Achos Zikukaso. Alright, this ends the 14th parak of the Masechta. Now we begin in parak Ha'isha Shalom, which begins with Ha'isha Shahocha Hi Ubayla Medinas Yam. Then it says Shalom, and this is discussing the topic of a woman and her husband who traveled to Medinas Yam. Then she comes back and she says her husband died in Medinas Yam. Can we trust her or not? So there are 2 factors to consider. First of all, what was their relationship like, and what was the situation in the world? If they were fighting, that's a strike against believing her, because could be she wanted to get out of this marriage, or she wanted to asa herself on him, and therefore she came back. She wants to get remarried she wants to marry someone else, which would make her also to her husband. The other possibility, the other factor to consider is there a peace or challenging situation in the world? Is there a war or some other situation of sakana which would make her unreasonably assume that he died, even though she's not 100% sure? If there was a war and he was fighting in a war, we have a strong reason to suspect that she doesn't know he died, she just assumes he died. And therefore, in a situation where there's a war, we're not going to accept her word. So the Mishnah begins by ruling as follows. The only way where you can assume that you can trust her is if neither of these mitigating factors are there. There's peace between them, between the husband and the wife, and there's peace in the world. There's no reason for her to assume he is dead without knowing fully. If, however, there is an argument between her and him, we can't trust her. If there's an argument if there's a war in the world or something like that, then we can't assume that she checked out and made sure that he really died. It's likely that she she's not sure he died. Now, the Mishnah doesn't spell out the reason, but that's explained by the Gemara. Now, the Gemara says, the Mishnah says that Rabbi Yehuda goes a step further. He says she's not fully trusted, even if there's peace between them and peace in the world, and there's no problems in those factors. You need to see signs of mourning on her. She can't just come and say, he died, I'm very happy. No, she has to be coming with torn clothing, or she's got to be crying. She has to see some sign of avelus. Rabbanan said, no, you don't have to see that. All you need is the factors which we required. Okay, we now begin the Gemara. Now, the Gemara comments when we said you need to have both factors. You have to know that there's peace between them and there's this peace in the world. You don't have to actually know that. The reason the Mishnah said that there's got to be peace between them and the world is in contrast to the case where you know that there's war in the world or that they were fighting. Because that's where, if you know either one of those, you can't believe them. You don't have to know that there was peace. It's enough if you just don't have active knowledge that there was a war in the world or that they were fighting between them. Which means the Gemara is addressing the situation in which you don't have any knowledge. You don't know where there's a war or not. You don't know if they had shalom bayis or not. So there, you can trust them. It's only where you know that there's one of these mitigating factors that you have a problem and you can't believe them. Now, the Gemara quotes Rava, who explains the problem with knowing there's a war in the world is that she's going to assume that he didn't survive. The Gemara says there's two ways she can make a mistake with that. Number one, she may think, listen, so many people were killed in this war, he probably was killed as well, even though she hasn't seen anything happen. Or even if she saw him get hit by an arrow or stabbed with a spear, she may assume that that's a deathly wound. She didn't want to stick around to find out because she didn't want to get killed herself. But these things can be cured by a special type of dressing called smatri. So there's a way to save one from that. All right, now the Gemara discusses a number of other dangerous mass casualty events. The Gemara wants to know, do they count as war? Do we have the same concern that she didn't check out and have final knowledge that she died, that her husband really had died, and she makes a premature assumption that he died? Now, the Gemara doesn't say what the key factor is here. There's a few different approaches in the Mefarshim. One approach might be that we need to know, will she stick around? Or is she afraid and she needs to run away to save herself? So the Gemara's first topic is if there's a famine. Nobody can eat. So she comes back and she says, my husband died from famine. So the Gemara says, Rava first said that she's trusted there's no reason why she would have to assume that unless she knew it was for sure true. She didn't have to flee. She wasn't in mortal danger herself. Now, Rava changed the psak at some point and said, no, if there's a famine and in the world, that's also an issue. And then Rava even went a step further and said that famine is even worse. She's even less believed there. Now, what happened? So the Gemara says, there was a woman who came to Rava and said, my husband died in a famine. Rava wanted to check her out to make sure that she actually knew that he died until the end, but he used chachma. Instead of asking her, he said, you did very well that you saved yourself and left while he was still alive and still had a little bit of flour left, because that was not enough to save anybody. And she said, oh, I'm so glad that you also understand that kind of flour that was left was not enough to save him. So Rava there clearly saw that she hadn't stayed to the end, and based on that, Rava now said it's not enough. She's not trusted in the case of a famine because there's a good chance that the same thing happened again. Then Rava went a step further and said in the case of famine it's even worse, because in the case of a war, it's only if she says my husband died in the war that we're afraid she didn't check it out until the end. If she said he died from some other thing, she died at home in bed. Okay, so the fact that there's a war happening at the same time, we don't have to assume she's lying and it was really in the war and she said it was in his bed. We don't have to go to that length. However, in the case of the famine, so famine's all over the place. Even if she says, she doesn't say he died in famine, we have to assume that he died. She thinks he died because of the famine, and she might still be wrong. The only way you can actually trust her is if she says, I buried him. I saw his burial. I know that he was dead for sure. If you have that testimony, then you could trust him. So that's a step further even than the war. Now, the next type of thing is what happens if the house fell down. That is, he was in a house that collapsed, or he was in a city that got struck by a hurricane and all the houses collapsed. So the Gemara says that counts like a war. Again, she may assume that he died without full knowledge. Now, if he was under attack by snakes and scorpions, there's the same thing. She also assumes that he didn't survive, even though he may have, and he's not trusted. Now, about that, there's a machlokes. One opinion says Snakes and scorpions, yes, everyone agrees. If there's a plague, if there is a pandemic, epidemic in the area, severe, you have a machlokas. Some say she's not trusted because she'll assume he died without full knowledge. Some say no, she understands. Some people survive every plague, like this expression people say that there was a plague for 7 years and nobody died unless it was his right time to go. So therefore, is machlokas whether or not she can be trusted in a situation of a plague.